Yes, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco's event with Akemi Johnson regarding her book, Night in the American Village. I'm going to show off the cover here. My name is Ravi Chandra. I'm a psychiatrist and writer in San Francisco. And I just feel, I was listening to the song No Man is an Island by Dennis Brown. But I feel like after reading Akemi's book, I feel like if I were an island, it would be Okinawa, just because the writing is just absolutely beautiful, telling a really incredible story about kind of living in the split between a lot of forces that are out of any individual's control. And I think that resonates with me, particularly at this time. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, just like no man stands alone, I think no island stands alone either. So we're going to hear about Okinawa and all of the impactful forces that, that surround it and emerge from it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Akemi Johnson. Oh, let me give you her introduction from her book cover. Akemi Johnson is a former Fulbright scholar in Okinawa and has written about the island for The Nation, Travel and Leisure, Explore Parts Unknown, and other publications. She has also contributed to NPR's All Things Considered and Code Switch. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and Brown University, she lives in Northern California. So Akemi, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for being here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing any thoughts or questions you might have on this topic. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the book for people who might not have read it yet, and also show some images from my time in Okinawa. And then, as I said, I'd love to hear from all of you. So this is also, this is hosted by the Brown Alumni Club. So I just wanted to mention this started as my senior honors thesis at Brown. So I'm very indebted to Brown for making this book happen. So shout out to Brown. So I'm just curious to begin with, like, have any of you been to Okinawa before? And I can see most of you, so you can just raise your hand. Okay, so Stan and Jason. Okay, great. For those of you who might not know as much about Okinawa, I'm going to show some images. Let me get this going. Okay, so can you all see that map? Yeah. Okay, so here's Okinawa, right? So here's Japan. Okinawa is way down here. It's its own chain of islands, and you can see how far it is from the rest of Japan, what we call mainland Japan. It's very close to Taiwan and China, and it's different from mainland Japan in many ways. It has a subtropical climate. So it has these gorgeous beaches, white sand, blue water, really tough place to do research. It has its own distinct culture and languages and history because it was an independent kingdom, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And Okinawa also has a very heavy US military presence. So here's another question for you guys. And maybe if we can use the chat. I don't know if I can see the chat from here, but, or you can just chime in maybe. Who knows or can guess how many US military bases there are around the world outside of the United States? Let me see if I can see the chat. Okay, we got one guess for 800. Anyone else want to guess? 1,500. Okay, so you guys are on it. So a lot of people, when I do this, they guess like 100, 150, but there are as many as maybe 1,000 US military bases around the world. So this has been called an empire of bases. It's a lot of bases. And if we want to understand this phenomenon better, Okinawa is a good place to start because it has one of the highest concentrations of US military bases overseas. So about 1 in 8 US service members who are stationed abroad are in Okinawa. And most of the bases are on the main island of Okinawa. This is that island there. You can see all the bases, how much space they take up. And so before I ever visited Okinawa, the first time I went was in college, I really had heard a lot about the protest against these bases. And, you know, that's what I expected to encounter when I was there. And while there is a strong resistance movement in Okinawa, which I'll talk about, you know, I was surprised because a lot of people I met seemed to have more ambivalent feelings about the bases. And for them, the base issue was complicated and tied up with a lot of intimate issues and personal experiences. So writing this book, one of my goals was to tell a different kind of story about Okinawa, one I hadn't heard much before. In a lot of the stories I heard, Okinawans were cast as victims of the United States and Japan. And the people I met didn't see themselves as victims. Instead, they were choosing to actively engage with the US military presence in some way. These were Okinawans with agency, and with their agency, they could either help these bases remain in Okinawa, or they could resist them, and in that process, challenge the whole US-Japan security alliance. So that's kind of what's at stake here. In my research and reporting, I decided to focus on women because they're arguably the most affected by the bases. They are the ones more likely to date and marry US service members, to work in the entertainment areas around the bases, and to be the targets of sexual assault. So before I go into a few of these women's stories, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Okinawa. So as I said, it was an independent kingdom called the Ryukyu Kingdom. This was the old seat of government called Shuri Castle. Unfortunately, it recently burned down, but they are going to rebuild it. It was in the late 1800s that Japan overthrew this king and annexed the islands as a prefecture. After that, Okinawans were pressured to assimilate and lose their indigenous culture and language and become, you know, quote unquote Japanese. By the time World War II came along, many Okinawans did consider themselves Japanese, and soon that identity was called into question on the battlefield. So some of you might know this history. On April 1st, 1945, the United States military invaded the main island of Okinawa. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, with high casualties among American and Japanese troops. But the highest loss of life was among Okinawan civilians. In that battle, as many as 1 in 3 Okinawans lost their lives. So when I was researching this, you know, there were so many, horrible stories, but I think some of the most haunting and horrible for me were these cases of when Japanese soldiers during the battle pressured or forced whole Okinawan families to take their own lives and those of their loved ones, rather than surrender to the Americans. There were also accounts of Japanese soldiers kicking Okinawans out of their hiding places, killing them directly, taking their food. And so, you know, while Okinawans had come to consider themselves Japanese and were willing to fight for Japan, many in the Japanese military still saw them as the other and saw their lives as expendable. Okinawans who lived through this battle were shocked to find that the American victors weren't the devil beasts that they had heard about. Instead of mass killing and torture, Americans after the war provided food, shelter, and medical aid to Okinawan civilians. And this was the start of Okinawans' complicated relationship with the US military. So as you might know, after World War II, the US occupied all of Japan, including Okinawa, but it stayed 20 years longer in Okinawa until 1972. And it was during this occupation of Okinawa when the US started closing bases on the mainland Japan and building them in Okinawa, because in Okinawa, they still had total control of the island. So Okinawans call this by bulldozer and bayonet, because at times the US military forcibly removed Okinawans from their homes and bulldozed their homes to build US military bases. Even when Okinawa became a part of Japan again in 1972, the bases stayed. So in this history, I was really interested in the tensions and the kind of conflicting experiences and ideas relating to the US military presence. And so I was surprised because, well, okay, I'm gonna read a little bit from my book now, just a little bit. So this is from a night in Okinawa, and this photo is setting the mood here, when my friend, who was an American named Kate, said to me, "I wanna take you to a place that's like an inside out sock." And she led me through the entertainment area outside a base in Okinawa City. So this is where that photo is. It's called Gate 2 Street. Kate and I turned south from the main drag. As we entered a building on a side street, Kate said, "This is either the Okinawa in America or the America in Okinawa. Same thing, I guess." The sign on the door read reverse. She pushed it open, and inside, on a brightly lit stage, was a band in American 1950s costumes. They were either locals or from mainland Japan. The female singers wore poodle skirts and beehives, and the male crooner sported a silver suit and Elvis hair. I felt like I'd entered a David Lynch movie. The song Can't Hurry Love began, and a dozen middle-aged local women rushed to dance in front of the stage. A white man grooved at their center. The bar area was spotted with a few more grizzled Americans. "He's probably been here since the Vietnam War," Kate said, pointing at one of them. Sipping cocktails at the bar, we watched the dance floor fill after the band broke into La Bamba. When the Richie Valens hit had come out 50 years before, the island had been under American control. The 1950s and 60s, per the history books, were a time of Okinawan poverty, racial and sexual violence, and land seizure and protest. Life under American rule had been difficult for Okinawans. But here in reverse, the bar goers swimming to Surfing USA suggested a different kind of memory, a nostalgia for that time. It was Kate's inside out sock, a story inverted to reveal the hidden, messier side. And so this wasn't the only kind of tribute to America that I started noticing on the island. I started noticing so many things like this that seemed to celebrate America, and especially that occupation era. This is the shopping center that used to be American military base housing from the 1950s, and it had been repurposed to become like cafes and shops. And so you can see the branding they're using is like 1950s kind of American diner. This is one of those stores. So this is the old base housing in Okinawa. It's very like it's a cement box to withstand the typhoon winds. This is outside a base in Okinawa in a bar area. So someone had painted old American cars on the benches. This is a restaurant in Okinawa owned by this older Okinawan couple who just loved everything American, and it served pretty bad steak and pie and like canned carrots and peas. This is in the American Village, so which is in the title of my book. So the American Village is like an open air shopping center, but it's also kind of like a Disneyland USA. And this is some of the stuff that's in there. So this is USA Hood Quarters, American Depot in the American Village, Statue of Liberty. Inside you can buy like all this US military gear. There are old Air Force posters on the wall. Uncle Sam is there. You can buy old TV guides there, which kind of blew my mind. I don't know how these all got there, and like Life magazines, all these old American things. This is in the American Village. So it's actually a place where like local people hang out. So both Okinawans and military families. So again, in this, I was really interested in the tension. So and kind of contradiction. So the difficult history and protests against the US military presence alongside this kind of intimacy with America and what you might even call a celebration of America. I was interested in exploring these tensions with the women I spoke with as well. I profile 10 women in my book. One of them was Arisa, and this is a photo of Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. It's the biggest US Air Force base in all of Asia, so it's very large. Those runways are 2 miles long. And Arisa was an Okinawan woman who grew up near this base, and she shared this story of her childhood that really struck me. So she said when she was growing up, her dad made a game of walking around this base. So he would kind of challenge her and her sister to, okay, today let's walk around this base. It would take them about 4 or 5 hours. And Arisa's parents were politically against the US military bases. So, you know, maybe he was trying to show, you know, how much space this takes up, how unjust that is. But to Arisa, it was a fun game. It was an adventure, and it kind of helped create this, you know, evocative image of the base in her mind. And so she went on to grow up and marry a US serviceman and have kids with him. And she became someone who no longer had to circle this base, but could actually cross the fence and go on the base because she had base privileges. When I talked to her, she told me that she was happy with her life choices, but she felt some internal tension about the base issue. She felt like her spirit was Okinawan, and she did think there should be a reduction of bases, but she felt like she could never get involved in the anti-base movement because her husband worked on base. And her parents too, who used to be, you know, politically against the bases, had come to feel more ambivalent about them too. So I found that for a lot of women, the US bases had some kind of effect on their identity. And I was surprised, you know, because I think we hear a lot of stories, you know, about sexual assault, which I can talk about more later, and, you know, other ways that women are victims of these bases. But I found that a lot of other women were using these kind of American spaces that are created by the bases to express parts of themselves that they felt they couldn't express in Okinawan or Japanese society. This was especially true when it came to escaping traditional Japanese gender roles. So some women told me they preferred to work on the base because they felt like men and women were treated more equally there. Some women preferred dating American men. There was actually this subculture of women on the island who only dated American men, and it was often only of one race or another. And so I spent some time kind of exploring what was behind that. You know, but while there are these women who are choosing to interact with the US military base, there are others, many others, who are fighting to close these bases. And so this here in the pink, this is Chie. She's another woman, a woman that I profile in the book. She's an anti-base activist. And what she and others were protesting mainly is this new US military base that's being built in Okinawa right now. It's on the construction site is this bay called Ora Bay, and I got to go there. It's a gorgeous bay. It has a coral reef ecosystem, endangered endemic species, and the plan is to fill in this bay with sand, rocks, and gravel, and build a giant new military base. So what Chie and some others have been doing is going out on kayaks onto the bay to protest this construction and actually try to like get in there and stop or slow the construction. There they are. Other protesters are on land at this construction site. So people have been holding a sit-in there, trying to block the construction trucks from coming through. And many of these Okinawan protesters are elderly who lived through World War II. And like this gentleman I met, he survived the battle of Okinawa and lost his brother during it. And so, that horrific experience is what motivates a lot of these anti-base activists to, not have another US military base on their island. You can see more photos from the protests. There's some hired security that removes them every so often. So this situation is still going on in Okinawa today. Okinawan people have voted to say they don't want this new base, but the Japanese government has been moving forward with building it, and they've started dumping that sand and gravel into the bay. But this last photo I have to share with you guys, to me, shows how it's also complicated. So when I was there that day at the protest site, there was this activist in the green who stopped to talk to her friend who was an Okinawan man who worked on the base. And so they had this conversation through the fence. And, so this woman knows that if she's successful and this base closes, her friend is going to lose his job. And to me, this photo also shows how, we might think of these two places on and off base as very separate, but, like all borders, they're porous, and there's this constant exchange happening between the two places. So I'm going to stop it there, and I would love to hear from all of you and questions or comments.
Okay, yes, thank you so much, Akemi. And those are really great images to bring home the reality of Okinawa. And I'd like to start this discussion with a few minutes of my own questions to you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And we have about 10 other people. And so please, if you're in the audience, please prepare your questions and think about what you'd like to ask. So first, well, first of all, just a technical question. You said you started this project while you were a student at Brown. So maybe you can kind of walk us through that process and why you chose this project and how much time you actually spent in Okinawa and researching Okinawa.
Yeah, so I first went to Okinawa in 2003 when I was a college student, so many years ago, and I was most interested in this school there that's for primarily biracial kids, so they're half Okinawan, half American. I'm also biracial, and so I was really interested in a school like that. And I was a volunteer teacher there. I wrote my senior honors thesis on that school. And then I just kind of couldn't stop thinking about Okinawa. My mom's family is from Japan, but from mainland Japan. So I don't have a personal connection to Okinawa. But again, I think as a biracial person, especially, I really kind of felt like I recognized something in the place. And I was really interested in this kind of mix and clash of cultures and nations and people there, Japan, Okinawa, and the United States. And so I was lucky enough to get a Fulbright grant to go back in 2008. And at that time, I got to live there for a year. And so living there, was an amazing experience and let me really build relationships over time with a lot of different people who are there. And I kept working on it, for 10 years. And I went back for a few months in 2017 to update my research and reporting. And so I could ultimately finish the book. It came out last year.
Okay, wow. So a long process, and a process that really involved resonance with your own identity as well. And so, yeah, so maybe you could talk about that kind of, what was it for you about being biracial that also resonated with Okinawa?
Well, I think, so I'm fourth generation Japanese American. So I had never been to Japan until college. But I have a Japanese first name, and, in the US, I often people say, what are you? What kind of name is that? I say I'm half Japanese. It's a Japanese name, but of course, when I went to Japan, people in Japan did not see me as Japanese at all, right? I was American to them. And so I didn't, I kind of, there was a disconnect there in Japan. So when I went to Okinawa, I was just kind of amazed because it's so different than the rest of Japan that I'd been to. And it seemed like a place where there was more space for someone like me, someone with a mixed identity. And I felt like there were kind of a lot of parallels to Okinawan people's story too, because they have kind of been put in this position of being in between Japan and the United States and had their identity really shifting over the years. I think lately there's been a resurgence of indigenous Okinawan identity, but at times, they were pressured to become Japanese. And then during the occupation in the US, there was a large American influence too on Okinawan people. So, and of course there are a lot of mixed race people and interracial families, international families in Okinawa too. So it was somewhere I felt much more comfortable, even though I was very much always an outsider there.
Okay, thank you. And I think as an Asian American, I can certainly identify with living between cultures, even though I'm not multiracial or biracial. But that idea of creating a new identity in the middle of other identities is something that I think a lot of Asian Americans certainly can resonate with that story. But maybe, and that's what I also found so beautiful about your stories of these, was it 11 women, 10 women, but that they were all, you present vignettes of their lives and portraits of them, but also then present the issues and surrounding them and how they had kind of tangled with or been empowered or been defeated, or how they were making their peace and creating identity in the middle of this. So yeah, I don't know if you'd like to comment about that.
Yeah, about the women who I met. Yeah, so so I focused on women who were in some way connected to the U.S. military base presence, and I wanted to kind of have kind of different representations of different ways women were connected to the bases. So there are women who are dating and marrying service men. There are ones who are working on the base, working outside the base. One woman is a Filipino woman who came to work in the entertainment area outside a U.S. military base. And then I have a mixed race woman whose father was a U.S. service member. And then also I have activists who are fighting to close these bases. And then the woman who opens it was the victim of a murder actually by a U.S. serviceman. So, I think in a lot of these women's stories, they, like you mentioned, they, because they're connected to the bases, they are also grappling with these questions of identity and where do they fit in this larger scheme of Okinawa, Japan, and the United States. And in these very multicultural borderlands around the bases where you really, these physical spaces where there's very much a mix of people and cultures and languages.
What really comes through the stories of these women, and first of all, I think, at a basic level, I don't think as a psychiatrist that the psychologies of men and women are all that different. However, I think women are more in tune with and closer to vulnerability in life. Because of biological issues, certainly, but also because of society. And so I think can really tell a really, Muriel Rukeyser said, if one woman told her story, the world would split open. And I think we're kind of at this place where, certainly on Okinawa, but around in America, certainly the world is split open. And the beauty of what you've done is really tell the story in the middle of the split, in the middle of these polarizing dualities and dichotomies, what is forming there. Just one comment, you actually mentioned a famous quote in Okinawa, their kind of national motto. And I actually remembered that from an exhibit on Okinawa life is most precious, something that the last ruler of Okinawa said, Shotai, back in 1879, when control was going back to the Japanese government. And he basically emphasized life is our treasure. It's about life and survival, I think, and dealing with suffering is so important. So maybe you could talk about that national motto a little bit and how it informed your perspectives about life and how the Okinawans view life.
Yeah. So that was I heard that motto repeated a lot by the anti-base activists that I spent time with, and a lot of people linked that to the war, and so that's what those survivors of the Battle of Okinawa took away from it, is that life is the most precious treasure and has to be protected at all costs, right? And so I think this kind of peace mission or emphasis on life was driving a lot of the activists, because they did not want to live on a militarized island. They didn't want to be connected with a military of any country in any way. That's not what they stood for. They didn't want the kind of the legacy of that war to continue through this militarization. So, I saw that motto was very strong with a certain group of people, but then I think, there was a generation gap. So a lot of the younger Okinawans, of course, they hadn't lived through that war, and they might not even have learned about the history completely. That was what some people told me. Education in Japan is nationalized, so everyone across the country learns the same thing in school. So people said there was really a gap with Okinawans' knowledge sometimes of their own history. And so people who hadn't actually lived through that history might not know it. And in many ways, I found younger Okinawan people could be just like, Okinawan people or young people anywhere in the world in this kind of globalized world. So I saw that, very differences among different groups and definitely among generations.
Yeah, and certainly one thing that I think of, if you consider life is most precious, what kind of takes away life or crushes life? And so you talk about all these forces, whether it's militarism or the military base or masculinity, toxic masculinity. But I think at the core of it, there's this, and this will be my last question, this objectification, which you mentioned. And it's so interesting because you talk about how some women are particularly attracted to Black men. And what I so loved and resonated with was that one woman said they have better hearts or bigger hearts. And I think that's so powerful to recognize in this time of Black Lives Matter, that something in the Black servicemen recognized that other servicemen, white servicemen, were perhaps objectifying the women in a way that they didn't, and that they kind of treated them as human beings. And these women who liked them recognized that. So maybe you can talk about that, the interactions, particularly between the Black servicemen and women.
Yeah, so this was kind of a subculture, as I mentioned, that I was really interested in, and I spent some time with some of these women. So there's a group of women in Okinawa, and they have like a word for this type of woman, kokujo, and can be seen as a negative term, but I saw some women kind of come to embrace it. And it's for women who decided they only want to date African-American men. And so I really wanted to know, what was behind this. And I spent, time talking to women. And, I did find some kind of problematic things like, oh, they have cool music, I like their cars, stuff like that. But when I kind of dug deeper, I saw that there was a history of this, of kind of alliances and relationships between Okinawans and Black servicemen in Okinawa, starting really during the Vietnam War times, because people said they had a shared experience of oppression, living as a minority group, either with the Japanese or with white Americans, and that was an experience they could identify with. And so some Okinawan women told me, they felt like, as Ravi said, that Black men treated them more as human, or could just understand them better. They had a better connection with Black men because of the shared experience. And so, yeah, that was something very interesting that I hadn't heard about before I started doing this research.
Yeah, so that history of shared oppression really resonates. So now I'm going to open it up. I'm going to go to the gallery view, and I'll look for raised hands or reactions, or you can drop into the chat if you have a question. Okay, I see one hand. Sandy, all right. If you want to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I know Okinawa is where you spent the time, but I was curious how much you think that the dynamic that you talk about is peculiar to Okinawa, and whether if you went to Germany or Philippines or Greenland or any other place, you talked about this some in the book about how the sexual violence was a function of military training as much as it was anything else. And if you could speculate a little bit about what's different about Okinawa as opposed to other places that are where life centers around military bases.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I haven't done extensive research in other places, but I do think, there are a lot of similarities. I've read a little bit about it, and I think from what I've seen in a lot of places around the world where people are living around these spaces, there is kind of a push and pull with, some people want the bases for economic opportunities if they work on base, or they come to really connect with American culture too, and like having this American presence in their community. But then there are many people too who are protesting the bases for all kinds of reasons, right? The noise, pollution, environmental destruction, and sexual assault, as you mentioned, right? So I think those kinds of problems are happening probably wherever there's a US military base. And I think in terms of Okinawa, one thing that makes it more unique is that Okinawa is kind of in what some people consider a dual colonial situation, because it's not only the US military presence that's kind of oppressing people there, but it's the Japanese presence and history there. So, all these bases aren't in Okinawa because the US wants it there necessarily, but it's also because Japan wants them there. Japanese mainlanders don't want bases in their backyards, right? So they put them in the place in Japan that kind of has the least political power. And so Okinawa has had to contend with these two forces. There are also Japanese military bases in Okinawa too. So I think that is, that makes it different than some other places where there are bases.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. Anyone else? Oh, I see. Saren, is it, or Saren? Yeah.
Saren, yeah.
Saren. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm wondering what your impression is of the governor, Denny Tamaki, who is both a hafu and a military brat, with a really interesting backstory. How does he play out in all of this right now?
Yeah. Well, it's good to see you. I remember we met a long time ago at the Hapa Japan Festival.
I'm on your mailing list.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you for coming. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, the governor of Okinawa now is for the first time in Japanese history really is a mixed race person. So his dad was a U.S. Marine, I think, who the governor never even met. So he left his mom, I think, before Denny Tamaki was born, or as a baby, and so he didn't know his dad. He doesn't speak English, but he's half American, half white American, I think. So it's pretty remarkable. And to me, I mean, I was really excited when he was elected, because I think he, for so long, I would see kind of people like him were marginalized in Okinawa, and there was this assumption that if you didn't speak English and you were mixed race, you come from a bad family, or your mom was a certain kind of woman to be with an American soldier, your dad wasn't around, you know, like what's going on there? Why can't you speak English? You know, so the fact that he, with that kind of life story, has been able to become the governor, I think that's just kind of in a cultural sense, like very a good development for Okinawa and for people like him. There are many people like him in Okinawa. I think it's a really hard job. So I think he's going to face a lot of criticism because he has to try to keep all these different forces happy and tangle with the federal government. So, you know, I know some activists feel like he's not fighting enough to close all the bases. But he is really working hard to get this, stop the construction of this one base that I mentioned. So, you know, I think he's doing a great job, but I've just seen a lot of other politicians in that role kind of, sometimes, you know, someone told me they get sick and die a lot, you know, because it's an extremely stressful job to be in. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I see we have a fair number of women on the call too, so I want to make sure you all get a chance to ask something if you'd like. So please, please, I even recognize some names as well. So, so please chime in.
You can put it in the chat too if you.
Oh,
if
there's nobody in the chat, but yeah, if you want to
Okay.
put a question in the chat, that would be great too. Yeah. So. Yeah, I don't see any hands raised at the moment. I can kind of talk a little bit more or ask another question. Well, you know, one thing I think about is that Japanese phrase, children grow up seeing the backsides of their parents. So it's like the child sees what the parent doesn't want to admit to or can't see. And so that's kind of growing up in the shadow of power is the same way. So you talk specifically about a man, the activist Shoko, I'm just blanking on his last name. Shoko.
Yeah, Ahagon, or yeah, I haven't.
Ahagon,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So I think that's perhaps I had never heard of him, and he sounds like a really amazing person. So I think, you know, this is one thing that has grown in the shadow, one person who's grown in the shadow of power. So please, could you tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah, so he was, so I got to spend time on this smaller island off of Okinawa called Ie Island. And, you know, it's important to remember when you're talking about Okinawa, there's not just the one island, there are also all these smaller islands, and sometimes those are kind of forgotten about. But this one island is just off Okinawa, and it has possibly even a more troubled history. Starting with the Battle of Okinawa, the military landed there and everyone was forced to fight. There was a really high, you know, during the Battle of Okinawa, like men, children, women were mobilized to fight in these wars, sometimes with just like, you know, a bamboo spear. And so many people died on that island. And then after the war, they like made it in the whole island basically into a military base. And so there were some Okinawan people like Ahagon, who was there trying to, you know, farm the land and live as they had been living. And the US military came along and just said, you know, get off, you know, like leave, we're taking this land. And so he organized the farmers to really wage a battle against the US military, but did it in a peaceful way. So he had all these, you know, beliefs like never raise your hands above your ears because they think you might be trying to strike them, and talk to the US military as if they're children so that they can understand you. And they did a beggars march of the main island of Okinawa, you know, on foot, walking around Okinawa to try to raise awareness of their plight. And they were somewhat successful in that they reduced the amount of military on their island. I think now it's just a third of the island, you know, just a third as opposed to a larger space. But he, you know, he has a strong legacy among anti-base activists there who really, you know, believe in his stance of nonviolence and kind of try to live by a lot of his principles that he had.
Yeah, I believe they call him the Gandhi or Martin Luther King of Okinawa. So I think that's
Yeah.
somebody I wish I knew about before, another inspirational figure, as is the activist, her name's, what's her name? Yazu, I'm sorry, your activist.
Oh, Chie or
There's
woman?
Chie,
Oh,
but also
Suzuyo Takazato.
Suzuyo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some pretty phenomenal people working with this issue. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about Suzuyo.
Yeah, so Suzuyo Takazato is one of the best known activists in Okinawa, and she's, I think, in her 70s now. And so her cause is really US military violence against women, especially sexual violence. So what her group has been doing, Okinawa Women Act Against Military Violence, they've been trying to document every case of US military violence against women since World War II. So, you can imagine, right, a lot of instances of sexual assault are not reported. I think this was especially true, in earlier years. So nobody has a real good idea of the scope of the problem. So they've been, going through old newspapers, oral histories, anything they can find to try to document these cases. And so I have a copy of their report, and it's just, harrowing to read through it, because it's just, incident after incident is listed, especially during the occupation years, when US soldiers often didn't face consequences for their actions. There were so many sexual assaults, so many gang rapes, that like one every day, it seems like sometimes. And so you start to realize how much of a problem this has been over the years, and that it's still going on today. There are some high profile crimes I write about in the book. There was the rape and murder of a woman in 2016, but most of these crimes we don't hear about. And especially I think in Japan, women don't feel comfortable coming forward to report sexual abuse. So some US servicemen have admitted that they knew this, and that caused them to commit sexual assault in Okinawa because they felt like they could get away with it. So it's a very big problem. And so Suzuyo Takazato, I think, is doing really important work to raise awareness of this issue. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from the chat about the status of coral reefs in Okinawa, besides the coral reefs in the bay that are getting filled for a U.S. base. So about the coral reef. Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, I definitely didn't look at the environmental aspects of Okinawa as much, but from what I understood, there aren't coral reefs like everywhere in Okinawa. So this bay, Ora Bay, is special because it has kind of an undisturbed coral reef ecosystem. And so that's what makes it even a bigger deal that they're going to destroy it, because it's not like the whole island is ringed in coral reefs, in my understanding. Or if it is, that, a lot of the parts of the island are very populated and used for beach resorts and everything. And this bay where they're building the base is more undisturbed. It's been left to its natural self, and there's also these manatee-like creatures that are endangered that live in this bay. And that's the only place they can get like this seagrass. And so the activists are saying these manatee-like animals, they're called dugongs, are going to be killed or die out if they build this base.
Yeah, let's see. Stan.
Thank you, Akemi. I was wanting to get back to what you had mentioned about there being like this triad of Okinawans, US military, and Japan. And my understanding is that there was great hope that when it reverted back to Japan, that things would get better. And then there was great disappointment because it didn't, like nothing changed, the basis stayed. And recently there's been a rise in Uchinanchu interest in language and culture. So do you see, so what is the view or relationship between Okinawans and Japan, and like, is it moving apart or?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I mean, I saw a lot of variety, I think, when I was there on that topic. I mean, there's one group of Okinawan people, a small group, but there's still a group who want to become independent from Japan again. And they're really advocating for that. They want to restore sovereignty to Okinawa. I think most people don't want that, but I think most people do want more autonomy. They say that democracy is not functioning in Okinawa because they're voting to say, you know, we don't want this base, for example. And Japan is just, Tokyo is saying, we don't care, basically, what you think, we're doing it anyway. And so people, I think, feel like they haven't been treated as equal citizens throughout their history with Japan. And that's something they very much want. So like you said, I think it's been great because there's been this resurgence of Okinawan language, culture, identity to try to get back what the Japanese government tried to erase very forcibly when they annexed Okinawa or took over Okinawa. You know, but at the same time, I think there are people in Okinawa who just feel Japanese and don't think about it as much, or there might be people who are, you know, maybe one of their parents is Japanese, one is Okinawan, and so they have more mixed feelings about it. But I think as a generalization, I think whether it's moving towards more of an Okinawan identity again, as opposed to, like you said, in the 70s when there was like this fervent call to be part of Japan again, and then they faced a lot of disappointment with what actually happened there.
Yeah, a question from the chat. So clearly you're a consummate journalist, but the person in chat asked to talk more about the process of getting all these women to open up and talk to you and trust you.
Yeah. So I think a key part of that was, as I said, that I could live there for a year, and you know, during that time I built relationships. So you know, I was living in this neighborhood that I was writing about. I was living like right across the street from a US military base. And so, you know, I met a lot of different kinds of people just, you know, through living there and through my interviews. And so I think by being able to meet people through other people was one way I could, you know, help gain people's trust. And then also just being able to take the time to be there and get to know people over time, that helped. And then, you know, I did change a lot of names in here. If they wanted me to change their name, I did that because I was really, you know, respectful of the fact that these are very personal stories and they're difficult to share. So I wanted women to feel safe in that sense, that if they wanted to remain anonymous, they could. Yeah.
And so how did you actually meet them? And another question from the chat, do you speak Japanese?
So how did I actually meet them? Like, does that mean like,
Yeah,
did I?
Curious, like, I mean, did you just walk up to them at Lawson's?
No, I didn't do that. So yeah, it was like through other people. So I think if I did just like walk up to someone and be like, hey, they would be suspicious of me and not want to open up, right? So if I could, I would just, you know, it's like a snowball or like something that's, you know, growing bigger, right? So if I meet one person, then I ask them to recommend me to other people. And then, you know, soon you have this giant network of people. So, so that was really helpful. And then I studied Japanese at Brown. And so when I lived there in 2008, 2009 for a year, my Japanese got pretty good. And so I could understand a lot. It was not as good as speaking, but it's definitely fallen away. I think I was lucky, or it was easy, because in this book I was talking to people who mostly were connected to the bases in some way, and so their English was usually a lot better than my Japanese, so they were able to speak in English, and a few times I did use an interpreter.
Okay, anybody else? I see Sandy has a question.
This is asking you to put on your crystal ball. I mean, you sort of described this tension that exists. I mean, if you look forward to, I don't know, 2050 or something like that, where do you think this is all going?
I mean, I'd like to say there's going to be a change for Okinawa and that they can get the base reduction that they want, but I have to say I'm not very optimistic because this has been going on for decades already and without any change. So I honestly, I don't know what would have to happen for something to change. I mean, Okinawans have been resisting this new base since 1996 when they first proposed this plan. And they have succeeded in slowing it, but it's still, Tokyo is still moving forward. So, some activists thought someone would need to die to make a change. I mean, I honestly thought that wouldn't make a difference. So I mean, honestly, I mean, it sounds, however it sounds, I think one reason I wanted to write the book was to kind of help the understanding between these two groups of people, because I saw that the rhetoric was very polarized in Okinawa. So there were kind of the anti-base people, the pro-base people, and they would see each other as caricatures and were not really talking to each other. And I saw a lot of misunderstanding. So, my hope is that there's more nuanced discussions that go on, like the people in my book and looking at the kind of the more realistic reality of people in Okinawa. They might not be, completely against the base or completely for the base, but it is a lot more complicated than that. So I guess I hope that more productive conversations can happen. And I hope that, some bases do close, but I think it will also depend on kind of what goes on in that region in the coming years. And if Japan and the US thinks that's a location they really need to have bases in anymore, and kind of what happens domestically in the US too. Can we afford all these bases around the world? Do we need them? And I think that's a conversation we need to have as Americans.
Okay.
Question from the chat. Is your book available in Japan? And if so, what has been the feedback? And also, I would say, have the women, any of the women read the book or the community read the book, and what's their reaction as well?
Yeah, so it's not in Japanese yet. It's going to be translated and come out. I think the plan is in October of this year. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I think at that point, I'll hear a lot more feedback I'm hoping from Japanese and Okinawan readers. I think now, because it's in English, it's harder to get the response there. So I haven't heard as much from Okinawan people. I have heard a lot from the US military community in Okinawa. It wasn't really the audience I was thinking of when I was writing this book, but I've been, pleasantly surprised to hear from a lot of people say that they, who thank me for this book and say it helped them understand the situation, and they can kind of see Okinawan people and the anti-base activists in a fuller way now and understand the situation more. So in terms of the people in Okinawa, I've heard from the US military community more. I do know, Chie, who's in the book, was really grateful for the book because her mom's story is in this too. Sachiko, who her mom lived through the Battle of Okinawa. She was a student high school student who was drafted to be a nurse during the war and just had a, horrific experience. And so she shared her story with me for the book. And just as we were finishing those interviews, Sachiko passed away suddenly. And so Chie was very grateful that we were able to capture her mom's story before she died, because it was something that Chie and her family had been wanting to do for so long, but they kept putting it off. Everyone was busy and everything. So, I felt really happy too that we could do that for her family.
Okay. Yeah, I'll ask something else since I don't see any hands raised at the moment. There's an Asian or perhaps African saying, "When the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled," and I think beyond kind of controlling or thinking about what the issues will do in the next 30, 40 years, your book really helps us stay close to the humanity of what's happening. So I definitely I thank you for that. We need ways to hold on to our humanity in this day and age, for sure. And I think your book wonderfully does that. So yeah, thank you. I mean, and you could have taken this book in different directions. What made you, maybe harking back to your original journey, what made you stay with that kind of emphasis?
Well, it definitely did. It definitely did go in many different directions over the years. Like there were many different versions of it. In the beginning, it was more just one woman's story throughout. And then she told me she didn't want to be in the book anymore. So I was like, okay, I don't have a book anymore. So I had to kind of start over. But I wanted to, so I think in the end, I'm glad for that though, because now I could highlight many different people's stories. And I think that's really important in terms of Okinawa, because there are so many important perspectives that we don't get to hear about. I think like one example was a Filipino woman who I talked to. And when I lived in Okinawa, I kind of heard people say, oh, Filipino women have been trafficked here, and, kind of just very dismissive comments or very limited information. And so I really wanted to get a woman's voice who actually had lived that experience. And, her story was very surprising to me. It wasn't what I expected. And so I think that was important to me, is getting past, preconceived ideas or stereotypes and really spending time talking to people and having them tell me what their story is.
Thank you. There was another question about language. What do the youngsters still speak Okinawan at home, and what do the schools in Okinawa teach as a language?
Yeah. So no. So Okinawan, their language. There's actually many languages, Okinawan languages, in all the islands. They are sadly dying out. I think some have already died out because during when Japan took over Okinawa, they instituted a strict Japanese only policy. And so Japanese was only taught in schools to the extent where there was like this game. So if students were caught speaking their native language, they had to wear a sign of shame around their neck. And the only way they could take off the sign was if they caught another student speaking their indigenous language, and then they would pass the sign to that person. So it was really like beaten out of people, and so it's died out. But there are people now who are working to preserve the languages and learn them and teach them to younger generations. But in terms of school, it's Japanese that people learn, and that's the first language of most people.
Okay. I don't see any other hands at the moment. Maybe we could just close perhaps with this question. Certainly, you talk about rape, the rape of women, particularly being the most galvanizing issue that grabs everyone's attentions, even though there are a lot of other bad things that happen. Murder with a hammer, for example, that you described. And so, but rape as a metaphor, unfortunately, is all too apt as well. I think for militarism and and ultimately on our effect on the earth and on the natural environment. So, but you do certainly, sexual assault is a theme that runs through your book, but maybe you could talk about. You also have a broader lens. So I just want, maybe you could describe a little bit about how you're thinking about how to kind of hold that severe, kind of violence within the whole story.
Yeah, well, I think I saw sexual assault being used as a metaphor, as you said, for the whole situation. And I think one issue I had was that it was only a certain type of sexual assault, and it was the only when that people would only get worked up about this and use it as this kind of metaphor when it was like a very pure victim. So the best known example was this 12-year-old girl, Okinawan girl, who was walking home from school and was gang raped by 3 American servicemen, and horrible story. And so people would say that is Okinawa, that's what's happened to Okinawa. And I think while that story is important and we need to know about it and work to end incidents like that, I think what's more often going on is a more complicated situation where, like that hammer story you said, there was a Japanese woman who was dating an American serviceman and he beat her to death with a hammer. And nobody cared about that story because she was dating him. And so people would say, oh, well, that was her fault. She was asking for it, or she was from Japan, so she's not Okinawan. So they're looking for this only particular one story where Okinawa is this, pure victim. And what I saw is that, it's much more complicated. A lot of people are choosing to interact with the bases in some way. And that doesn't make them asking for violence, or trouble. And that's just the reality, is that these people's lives are intertwined, and we kind of need to see both realities at once. So people are falling in love with American servicemen, dating American servicemen, and American servicemen are committing these heinous acts against Okinawan women, and it's all going on at the same time. And so I think kind of complicating that metaphor or allegory was important to me, while not at all downplaying the severity of the problem of sexual assault. So I was trying to tell like all these stories at once and say they don't negate each other. They can all be true, and we need to understand them all to be able to start to move forward.
But boy, that certainly tears at the heartstrings for sure when we hear about it, and so many times we don't hear about it. But do you think that the military could be screening their service members in Okinawa in particular better for sociopathy or conduct disorder or antisocial personality or something? I mean, I don't know what they do, but clearly not enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think those disorders you mentioned are what they found. This man who committed the 2016 murder he had, right? So yeah, I mean, something clearly went wrong there. This was a guy who, like, apparently when he was like interviewing for the military, he said, I want to kill people. And he had mental health issues in his past, and so he went on to abduct and murder this woman after he left the military, but he was still living in Okinawa. So I think clearly there are issues there, and I think we've seen violence against women in the U.S. military an issue, not only in Okinawa, right, but all over. There was just a woman, a female service member who was killed, right? I think she was maybe beaten with a hammer recently in the U.S., right? So this is not an issue unique to Okinawa or the U.S. military, but I think we could look at the U.S. military having certain factors that might make these violent incidents more likely to happen. So it's something we definitely need to look at in the U.S. military, but also, in places like Okinawa, where there's a population of people who, historically haven't had a strong voice in being able to, get their stories heard. And in Japan as a whole, there's an issue with women feeling comfortable coming forward to report sexual violence. So there's a lot there.
A lot, and
Yeah.
we could sure start with say screening our political leaders for sociopathy. I think that would be a good place for us all to start. Anything else from anyone Yeah, I don't see any hands raised. Well, oh, I
Oh,
do
there's
see
one hand.
Naomi.
Hello, I just wanted to take opportunity to, I guess, at least virtually, face to face. Thank you, Akemi. Perhaps to contextualize, I thought to put it in chat, but maybe better to just say, like, I'm actually, I guess what you would say, American Okinawan. I don't use that terminology, but first generation. So my parents actually met when my father was stationed at Camp Schwab, what is present day Henoko. For those who don't know, that's the site of where they're attempting to build, well, not build, but attempting to landfill in Oro Bay. And so I grew up with a lot of my own questions about this formation of identity and why are things so polarized amongst even my own family. And for better or worse, became even more apparent to me when my parents made the choice to move us to the States, related to a lot of the complexity, the challenges, the nuances of what that would look like raising kids there, yeah? And so unfortunately, I don't often get to experience, I have not found many who take the time to try to carve out space, to make space for these nuance, this necessary nuance to the conversation. Because again, I can look to my own family, and even within individuals, there's a complexity of feelings. So I just really wanted to thank you for the work that not only you have done, but continuing to do. I was going to ask about the intended audience because I really want that, not just this book, but your work in general to also be more readily available for Shimanchu, for Uchinanchu to be able to access as well. So thank you. And I guess that's a friendly nudge, friendly headbutt, if you will, nudge to please keep doing that. Please keep carving out the space. Please keep listening and being to signal boost these voices, because that's the other thing. A lot of times people speak for us and assume. So I just thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That means so much to me, and I would love sometime to hear more about your own experiences too, and within your family. And I really found what you were saying too. Of a lot of people I met, just it could be that this conflict was even within their own mind, like you said, not only in these communities. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Naomi and Akemi. I guess I would be remiss in, well, not in if I didn't mention two things. Of course, Okinawa is such a unique place. I have not been there, and so this is a wonderful tribute to Okinawa as a unique place. That's not Japan in that way, although it's under the umbrella of Japan. So I think that's wonderful, and thank you for reminding us of that, Naomi. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, since this is a Brown Club event, what do you think, or how would you describe the role of Brown in your formation of not just this project, but how did Brown influence you to become who you are today?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of you might not know, Brown doesn't have like general requirements like a lot of schools. So you can kind of just like take whatever you want to. And so I think that kind of attitude really gave me the freedom in college to explore whatever I wanted to. And this was like my most, what I was just really obsessed and passionate about. And I think that environment encouraged that kind of singular focus on my obscure interests, and supported me financially too. I got a grant to spend my first summer in Okinawa doing research there. And I think also like took my research as an undergraduate seriously, and I felt like a scholar when I was like 20 years old, and I could produce this scholarly work, and that became the foundation of a book and like what would become decade plus project. So yeah, I think I have so much to owe Brown for this book. So I'm really thankful.
Well, I didn't think it was possible for me to feel even better about Brown, but I do now. So thank you so much. All right, so we're after 8, we're at 8:15 now. So thank you again, Akemi. This was a wonderful book and an opportunity to talk about it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much to everyone who came out tonight. And it's really wonderful to see some familiar faces and new faces too. So thank you for making the time.
Thank you.
Feel free to reach out to me with anything else you might want to. On my website, you can message me. So